Psychology Behind Stories. Episode 2. The Secret History. Consider for a moment the most dangerous thing a human being can want. Not power, not money, not even love, exactly. The most dangerous thing a person can want is to feel chosen, to feel that they have been selected by some invisible hand of fate to belong to something rare and beautiful and above the ordinary world. Because once that feeling takes hold of you, almost anything becomes justifiable in its service. This is what Donna Tartt understood when she wrote The Secret History. And this is what most readers miss when they walk away thinking they've just read a novel about murder. They haven't. They've read a novel about seduction. Richard Papin arrives at Hampden College carrying the particular hunger of someone who has spent his entire life watching through glass. He comes from modest circumstances in California, a background he is quietly ashamed of, a life he considers beneath him. He doesn't simply want an education, he wants a transformation. He wants to become someone else, somewhere else entirely. And so from the moment he sets foot on campus, he is scanning his environment the way a starving man scans a room for food. Then he sees them. 5 students who move through the world as though they have already solved a problem that everyone else is still struggling with. Henry, magnetic and cold, possessed of a stillness that reads like superiority. The twins, Charles and Camilla, beautiful in that unsettling way that makes you feel slightly disoriented. Francis, eccentric and deliberate. And Bunny, loud, entitled, oddly out of place among the others, yet somehow indispensable to the group's atmosphere. At the center of this small constellation stands their professor, Julian Morrow. He teaches ancient Greek, though teaches is entirely the wrong word. Julian doesn't teach. He cultivates. He creates an atmosphere in which the ancient world feels not merely relevant, but alive. More alive, in fact, than anything the modern world has to offer. He selects his students the way a jeweler selects stones, and those he chooses come to understand that being chosen by Julian is itself a kind of identity. Richard wants in, desperately. And here is the first psychological trap the novel lays for us. Because Richard doesn't fall in love with ideas. He falls in love with the sensation of being invited into a beautiful room. The philosophy comes later. What comes first is the intoxicating feeling that someone extraordinary has decided he is worthy of their attention. This is not a small distinction. Throughout history, the most effective forms of manipulation have never really been about convincing people of ideas. They have been about making people feel seen, making them feel exceptional. The doctrine follows later, almost as an afterthought, a price the person is relieved to pay for a belonging they already cannot live without. As Richard moves deeper into the group, he begins to notice something. Their world is more enclosed than it initially appeared. They exist in a near-total orbit around each other. Information moves selectively. There are rules operating beneath the surface that outsiders cannot fully see. What had seemed like sophistication begins to reveal itself as something more like a closed system. If you have ever been inside a highly cohesive group, a tight social circle, a religious community, a family with rigid, unspoken rules, you may recognize the architecture. The stronger the bonds within the group, the less influence the external world is permitted to have. Over time, the group becomes its own reference point. It develops its own logic, its own language, its own version of reality. And once that process is complete, almost anything can be rationalized inside it. This is not a conspiracy. It happens naturally, gradually. with the best of intentions. The students become increasingly absorbed in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the idea that certain altered states of consciousness, ecstatic, Dionysian states, could grant access to deeper truths about existence. For Julian, this is an intellectual proposition. For the students, it becomes something more dangerous, a temptation, a project, an identity. There is a particular kind of hubris that appears in brilliant people, and it is subtler than ordinary arrogance. It is the quiet belief that understanding something deeply enough changes your relationship to it. That if you can analyze a force, trace its origins, discuss its history, place it within the correct philosophical framework, then perhaps you stand somehow above it, outside its reach. This group believes they have studied the ancient world thoroughly enough to enter it safely. They begin as scholars looking through a window, but wanting and studying occupy the same mind, and eventually the window dissolves. One night, they disappear into the woods to stop reading about the ritual and to begin living it. By morning, a local farmer is dead. Tartt doesn't slow down to dramatize the guilt. No confession or collapse. Instead, something remarkably practical takes over. They approach things practically. They calculate, discuss what can be proven and what cannot. The mind has a trick it performs after catastrophe. It evacuates feeling and replaces it with function. Anna Freud called this intellectualization, the retreat into analysis, when emotion becomes too expensive to face. Instead of grief, explanation. Instead of fear, pure logistics. And it always arrives with the same quiet promise: we'll deal with the feelings later. The tragedy is that later never comes. Such feelings cannot dissolve. They go underground, buried inside silences, operating beneath every interaction, until the surface itself becomes unreliable. Then there is Bunny, easy to underestimate. In a group defined by brilliance, he seems almost comical. But Bunny does something the others can't afford. He keeps dragging reality back into the room, not because he's wiser or morally superior, but because he refuses to fully inhabit the story everyone else has agreed to tell. Every time he enters a room, reality enters with him. He is a mirror they can no longer avoid. The decision to kill him doesn't arrive like a thunderbolt. It enters as a thought, a passing consideration, quickly set aside. Except it isn't. It returns. And with each return, it loses a little more of its horror and gains a little more of its logic. An idea entertained often enough stops feeling like a violation and starts feeling like a solution. This is what the novel is really about. We rarely experience moral collapse as collapse. We experience it as an adjustment, as reasonable decisions made under difficult circumstances. By the time they reach their conclusion, it doesn't feel monstrous. It feels necessary. And so, Bunny dies. But reality is more durable than the stories we build to manage it. Removing Bunny removes the mirror, but it doesn't remove the fear. The secret that once bound them together begins working like acid on the bonds themselves. Every conversation becomes careful. Every glance carries a subtext. Henry retreats into books, Charles fractures, and Richard watches from a distance he believes is safe. Still convinced he is the observer, not the participant. He never realizes the distance collapsed long ago. He crossed too many lines, through too many small compromises, to locate the moment it happened. The most dangerous forms of complicity are never the ones that feel like choices. They are the ones that feel like circumstances. Most of us will never face what these characters faced. But that's not really the point, because long before anyone died, the real damage was already being done. It happened quietly, in the ordinary moments, in the small decisions to overlook something uncomfortable, to stay silent when you should have spoken, to protect the group, the identity, the feeling of belonging, over the truth that was slowly becoming inconvenient. That is the pattern this novel is really tracing. Not murder, the much more common human tendency to find a story that makes us feel chosen and then build our identity around it, to tighten our grip when it's questioned, to become, over time, a little less honest, a little more defensive, a little more committed to the narrative than to the reality underneath it. And here is the uncomfortable part. We rarely notice when it's happening, because we're not doing it out of weakness, we're doing it out of love. For the life we've built, the people we've chosen, the version of ourselves we've worked so hard to become. That is the real crime in this novel, not what happens in the woods. What happens in the mind, slowly, over years, in the quiet process of deciding that the story matters more than the person you were before you entered it. The Secret History doesn't ask whether you're capable of extraordinary evil. It asks something far closer to home. How much of yourself have you already quietly surrendered to a story you were simply too afraid to leave behind? This is psychology behind stories. We use literature as a case study, not to review books, but to examine the human behavior that lives inside them. If this made you think, you know what to do. Like and subscribe, and see you next time.